Welcome to Critical Conversations, a Latinx learning series powered by the Ford Foundation and the Latinx House. Today's episode is The Impact of Incarceration and the Criminal Justice System on Latinx Communities. And now, welcome the co-founder of the Latinx House, Mónica Ramirez.
Hello, and welcome to Critical Conversations, a Latinx learning series presented by the Ford Foundation and the Latinx House. My name is Mónica Ramirez, and I'm co-founder of the Latinx House. The Latinx House is a home base for people who appreciate, support, and celebrate the excellence of the Latinx community. Today's episode, The Impact of Incarceration and the Criminal Justice System on the Latinx Community, is our fifth conversation in this series. We, along with the Ford Foundation, understand the systemic issues rooted in oppression that impact our communities on a daily basis when addressing the problems of reforms needed within the criminal justice system. The role that incarceration plays across the Latinx community varies from immigrant detention to the prison industrial complex. We also know that incarceration has a devastating impact on the system-involved individual as well as their families. Sometimes these harmful impacts can last for generations. I'm so grateful to the panel of experts joining us today to break down some of these issues and to help inform us to better understand as we seek solutions. And now to help me set the framework for our conversation, please welcome David Rogers, Program Officer with the Gender, Race, and Ethnic Justice Program at Ford Foundation.
Thanks, Monica. And a special thanks to the Latinx House for partnering with us on these very important conversations. There are more than 62 million Latinx people in the US and its territories. And it's estimated that there are 1.8 million people currently incarcerated in the US today. Nearly a third of the US prison population identifies as Latino. And that number doesn't take into account all of the people incarcerated by ICE in detention centers and jails around the country, nor does it account for the thousands of youth currently incarcerated in the juvenile justice system. We can't really transform this country's approach to criminal justice without a deeper understanding of the history and the current manifestations of mass incarceration and mass criminalization of Latinx people. But this is an issue where we can achieve progress and change. And I'm eager for this conversation about the necessary strategies and investments to help us shift the trajectory towards equity and justice. Today, we have the honor of hearing from some incredible leaders. And it's my hope that this is the beginning of a dialogue that will continue long after today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, David. We're excited to hear from today's speakers. We're confident that we're going to learn so much. It's going to be an excellent conversation. Now let's meet today's guests.
To continue our conversation, the impact of incarceration and the criminal justice system on Latinx communities, welcome the former co-director, Reenvision Justicia, Latino Justice, PRLDEF, Jerónimo Saldaña, and the director of the Office of National Affairs Drug Policy Alliance, Maritza Perez. And now, welcome today's moderator, writer, and creator, Brown Badass Bonita, Kim Guerra.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Critical Conversations. I'm very honored and excited to be here moderating this conversation with two amazing badass individuals in our community, Maritza Perez and Jerónimo Saldaña. This topic is very close to many of our hearts. It's close to many of our homes, our communities, and the culture that we want to shift. So I'm excited to hop right in with my first question for you, Jerónimo. So there's a lot of talk about the carceral systems and abolition movement, and these are terms that maybe not everybody knows what they mean. So can you please help us understand them a little bit better and define these key concepts that maybe will help folks understand more what these issues mean and the impact they have on our Latinx community?
I think the most important thing we really need to think about is we have these words tossed around: abolition, right? Getting rid of the police. getting rid of ICE, chinga tu migra is one of my favorite. What does it actually mean besides just those words? Well, when you say abolish the police, we're saying stop incarcerating Black and brown bodies. We're saying the police system was set up to perpetuate white supremacy, to save property, not to save people, right? If you see the horrible, horrible, vile tragedy that happened in Uvalde, that's white supremacy, that's policing. They didn't go in. Their job is to go in and to protect and to serve.
Protected their own.
When we say abolition, we mean we need resources in the community that don't involve the gun, that don't involve a club to the head. And we have amazing folks who are taking leadership and making this a reality. One of our hermanas, Eunices Hernandez, longtime resident of Los Angeles, of Council District 1, just won. And she became one of the first abolitionists to take power. Right. And she's not saying out there, we're going to get in the cops and have, she's saying, stop criminalizing us, stop arresting us, stop doing what you've been doing for the past 200 years in this nation, putting brown bodies in jail, either economically or carcerally, and let's put that money into our community. And I'll pass this to the hermana Maritza, who works in the drug war, which is actually a war on people of color. Marijuana was first criminalized in 1814 in Utah, I believe, El Paso, Texas, because Mexicans were using it, and they were just using it as an excuse to lock people up. So by abolition, we mean abolish killing our people, abolish beating us up. That's abolition.
That's right. And thank you for sharing how important it is that we use not only our voices, our bodies, everything that we are as a community to protect one another, because so many of us have seen how the police don't protect us. And that's a huge part of why we're having this conversation and why we need to continue to be out on the streets to organize and to communicate and work in unity, porque Black and brown, indigenous, queer, trans bodies are constantly being oppressed on the streets and off the streets in the system. So Maritza, we want to ask you, as part of the systemic oppression, as part of this criminal justice system that you see on the day-to-day, can you share some of the history? Because so much of the history we're feeling right now due to the intergenerational trauma that we carry and that we see all across the systems. Me as a therapist, I'm constantly thinking not only the people on the streets, but the people that are working in this field, how it is something that affects in so many different levels, the impacts of the drug and the economic policy within our communities, and how it has caused harm in so many ways, in so many generations. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I guess I would start by saying that Latinos in this country have not just a long history of oppression, but a long history of resistance. One thing that I did want to talk about when I think about history is Latino lynching. I think that's a part of our history that's not very well known. And I'll tell you that, I didn't even know about it until I was in law school. I was part of a death penalty clinic, and for that clinic, our professors took us out to Austin, Texas for a conference. And it was at that conference where the first time I learned about Latino lynching that occurred throughout the Southwest, most notably through about 1848 through 1928. And we saw that lynching was most prevalent both during the Mexican-American War, but also during the Mexican Revolution, when there was a lot of diplomatic tension, when there was a lot of dispute over land, over jobs. And all of that really just reminded me of what we see today, around the conversations around immigration, but also around the criminal justice system. What we know about Latino lynchings in the past is that they often took place with law enforcement present, actively involved. And not only that, but we know that very few individuals were ever brought to justice for lynching Latinos. We know that there were at least 600 lynchings, again, across the Southwest, most prevalent where we have high Mexican-American populations in states like California, Texas, New Mexico. But I think that history is really important because it connects to today. We can start with police killings, for example. Unfortunately, Latinos are undercounted throughout the criminal legal system, but we know that over the last 10 years, there have been at least 1,500 Latinos that have been killed at the hands of police. And we know that very rarely are these cases prosecuted. Very rarely is there a semblance of justice for the family. But I think that it also plays out in other ways. I was actually thinking about an example Jerónimo shared about marijuana. I think this is a very specific example of an anti-Latino policy that was really cloaked as drug policy. We know that the very first anti-marijuana laws in this country actually occurred around the time that we saw Latino lynching. And again, these laws were popping up in the Southwest mostly in the 1910s and the 1920s. And they were directed at Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans. And again, it was in the midst of really heavy anti-Mexican, anti-immigrant sentiment. And it was meant to target a cultural practice that Mexicans and Mexican Americans engaged in. But this is just one example, and I think it's a good one to bring up because we still know that marijuana enforcement remains a common cause of deportation and a common way that people get into the criminal justice system today. But marijuana is just like a drop in the bucket. I'll talk about other ways that we see this in a little bit.
And if I could just do a shout out to Maritza. Yeah. She actually wrote an amazing article about Latino lynchings that I read, which is how I learned about it. So gracias to you, hermana, for that. Very powerful.
Yes, thank you. Where can we find it, Maritza?
Well, it's on I put it on like my personal Medium post, but I haven't like published it online other than that. It's been published in a law review article, but unfortunately that law review article isn't published online. But I don't know, maybe I should get it online because again, this history is not very well known. Yeah.
Yes, we need to know this. We need to know this. Be informed of our history, and again, it's all tied to today. Like you were saying, like we see it with ICE, we see it with police killings, we see it with the systemic racism present in the schools, present in every part of the system that we are a part of, that we're living in.
Kim, if I could just add to that too, the crazy part is, what Maritza's talking about was white folks, right? You had white colonialists, the Rangers are white folks. Now, if you look at the police in Los Angeles, if you look at police on the border, they look like us. They look like us. You have oppressors that have taken on the white supremacy mantle and are doing that work. So it's no longer just a racial issue. You have Gomez's and Saldañas and Garcias who are doing the shooting.
The officers, Saldaña, yep. And that's part of like the oppressed become the oppressors, like the pedagogy of the oppressed. Like, so we have to, a lot of the systemic oppression has now become internalized oppression that we have to fight within our community, or even just not even fight, but educate. And so much of that has to be partnered with like the intergenerational trauma has to come intergenerational healing, where we have to stop seeing ourselves through the eyes of the oppressor. Because when we see ourselves through the eyes of the oppressor, we're never going to be free. Instead, we are going to become the oppressor of our people because then we see them through the eyes of the oppressor. So it starts with us, and the work that both of you are doing is so necessary and imperative. So I thank you. I thank you. I can't thank you enough, because I see, my dad was locked up when he was 17, and he still sees himself through the eyes of those Officer Garcia, he still sees himself through that. So much of this work is systemic and it's internalized, and it's not just one individual that is harmed. It is the families, the communities that they are a part of. And part of that, I want to ask you, Jerónimo, so in the detention system, we see the juvenile detention, we see ICE, we see the penitentiary, state and federal. How do these intersect with one another to create a lasting impact on not only the individuals, but us as a cultura, as a community? Because it's not just one person that is in the system, it's the whole community that is impacted by the system.
There's this amazing professor named Kelly Lytle Hernandez who has written extensively on this. She has this book called The City of Inmates, which is how incarceration of Native American folks, of Mexicans, of Black folks built Los Angeles. They literally had vagrancy laws, don't outside laws, your pants are too long laws that would lock people up and then force them to create Los Angeles. So since the inception of this nation, this settled colonial nation, as Kelly Lytle Hernandez calls it, our Black and brown bodies have been used just for labor. And if you try to go outside of that labor, they criminalize you. They close off the borders. Originally, the borders were open. Mexicans would come, they'd go to the harvest, they'd go home, and everybody was happy, right? But once we started to settle and to stay, they began doing mass deportations. I think maybe Maritza knows the year, the mass Mexican deportations during FDR's tenure, I think, unless I'm making up the year, but I think that's right. So it has been this just seeing of our bodies and our labor. And the fact that we call these places detention centers, they're prisons is what they are. It's not a detention center.
Right.
If you've ever been to one, these hieleras, they're horrible. They're almost worse than prisons, right? So one, the fact that when we think about Latinos in the mainstream media, the news stories you see is these stories of criminalization, whether it be in the immigration system or whether it be in the criminal justice system, and they're synonymous. It's double penalties, right? So if I'm undocumented, I live in the U.S. and they catch me for smoking marijuana, even though everybody smokes marijuana, white folks can smoke marijuana, that can trigger one, an arrest, time in the criminal justice system, and then deportation. So we've become synonymous with criminality, right? And I've learned a lot from Maritza and the work that she's doing, really dismantling that. So yeah, I'd also love to hear what you're saying as well, Maritza, because the work that Maritza does, she's one of the only, she's gonna get embarrassed, she's one of the only, Latinas, Latinos, Latinxes, Latins on the national level working on this. There are very few Maritzas out there who have the courage and have the bravery to stand up to this. So again, I follow her leadership on this a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Heddle. You actually made me think of a couple of things. First, when we were talking about Latino lynching, another way I see that resonating today is just with Border Patrol, going back to something that Jerónimo said. It's a heavily Latino police force, but it's also the largest police force in the U.S. and very unaccountable to the public. It's very hard to get information about Border Patrol. But another connection that I want to lift up, something that you said, Heddle, was about removal of Mexicans when our services were no longer wanted. So we saw that happen in the 1930s and the 1950s during troubling economic times for the U.S. And this is where we usually see a lot of violence against Latinos. Particularly during the Depression, we saw Latinos being deported back to Mexico. And I say deported, even though many folks who were caught up in that were born in the U.S., were Mexican Americans. But the government chose to do that in order to free up jobs for quote unquote Americans. So we see threads of this throughout history.
Right. Oh, I want to know too how y'all handle this knowledge with the responsibility, with the rage and the grief that comes up, because in so many ways as a community, we feel the impact, we feel the ripple effect of these systems, of these policies, of the lynching that so many of us didn't even know that we're carrying in our DNA, in our bodies, in our ancestors. And so what are some of the ripple effects and the long-term impact that you see in the members of our community that you've worked with or that you've just seen in general? And also how do you handle this as an activist?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the fact that trauma is felt in the body over generations. I feel like that's something our community doesn't talk as much about. But if you look at statistics, we know, and we just know by being Latinos and living in our community, that there are a lot of mental health issues that go undiagnosed and that could be exacerbated by the social issues that we have to face. And unfortunately, the criminal justice system just exacerbates all of this. I work in drug policy, so I'll take, the war on drugs as an example. We know that when somebody is sentenced to state or federal jail or prison for drug activity, that, it doesn't just impact the person who goes inside, but it impacts their entire family. You're essentially pulling a provider out of a household. You're pulling a beloved father, uncle, mother, sister from that household, and somebody who could be not just a financial contributor, but somebody who is a beloved member of the family. But unfortunately, Latinos continue to make up a huge portion of the prison population. We know that when we're talking about the criminal justice system, the impact goes far beyond serving your time in a facility and far beyond an arrest record, because unfortunately that record will follow you around for the rest of your life. It could impact your ability to find a job, find housing, go back to school, receive public benefits, to feed your family, to even vote in an election, to change the laws. So there are so many collateral consequences that can stem from simple contact with law enforcement, and certainly if you serve time. We know that there are literally more than 50,000 collateral consequences that individuals face across the country. And when I think about the fact that, Latinos are already underserved in so many ways in this country, we know that the criminal justice system, again, just exasperates that harm in terms of what we have access to.
Exactly. Or even just like you get so limited and so stuck, and like this is like the purpose of and the product of systemic oppression, where there is no mobility, and where they're kind of setting us up to perpetuate that intergenerational poverty, like that there's almost impossible to build intergenerational wealth and healing, because if your main provider is in and out of the system, if your main provider, if the parent, you don't have a stable parent home, that impacts the next generation, your ability to get a proper education, to go to get healing, to go into family therapy. Like none of that exists, or like that's not even an option. So it's just a cycle that keeps getting perpetuated unless there's actual reform, unless there's actual change. So with that, I want to ask both of you, like, what are the critical reform opportunities that would shift this, that would make this change and change some of those opportunities and mobility and resources for our community?
Yeah, so one area that I talked about this earlier, so I'll just go ahead and talk about it again. But one area that actually really excites me is around marijuana reform. So again, I work in drug policy, but I actually lead a national coalition at the federal level that works to end marijuana prohibition. And I'll start off by saying that when we're talking about the war on drugs and drug policy, again, marijuana is a drop in the bucket. Like ultimately, the Drug Policy Alliance wants to see a safe supply of legal drugs so that people can have bodily autonomy and use drugs in a safe way. But, this is the US, so we're starting with marijuana reform. I think it is a gateway drug to broader reform. And the reason I bring this up as an example of change that we might see soon is because we're already seeing, when we have seen over the last 10 years or so, nearly every state in the country at this point has legalized marijuana to some extent. So I'm really excited about that. The Senate is shortly going to be introducing a bill that's modeled after our House bill. And I'm really excited about the potential to get more energy behind both of those bills.
Yeah, so what Maritza was saying, reminds me of one of these really good friend we have, Jason Hernandez, who lived intergenerational trauma. He grew up in McKinney, Texas, in a poor neighborhood where he didn't know he had any other options but to be a drug dealer. His brother was a drug dealer. His brother was sentenced to prison. His brother was eventually murdered in prison. Jason took up the mantle, started selling crack cocaine, I believe, at the age of 16. When he was 21, he was incarcerated for life, plus 300 years. Jason was a Latino who was not supposed to get out. Thanks to President Obama, he was pardoned. He's out on the streets preaching to the mountaintops, trying to get other people out. And there's so many other Jason Hernandezes just like that. But there are also our family members. We really can't have this conversation without mentioning some names. Sean Monterrosa, he was murdered by the police, I believe 2 decades ago after the George Floyd killing. There's Paul Rea, who was murdered by police in his car, who is the cousin of Sonia Diaz, who's just an incredible, incredible leader. There's another one, Francisco Serna, who was a viejito with dementia, who was shot by the police while holding a crucifix. So if we can't walk outside, if we can't, take care of our elders, this trauma continues. If we don't think anything else is going to happen but prison, Jason Hernandez's are going to happen, right? When you keep seeing folks cutting aid, but saying, we're pro-life, but yet, it's legal to smoke marijuana, but it's not legal to take care of your own body if you have a uterus. So I guess a lot of this is just really so backwards, right? And if you're a rich white woman, you can get an abortion anywhere you want. Exactly. This is definitely designed for folks who are poor and who are people of color. This is us. All these laws, these marijuana laws, all these laws, they're for brown folk. They're for brown folk. And the fact that you have other brown and black folk enforcing them is absurd. And the last thing I'll say before I'll shut up is you've seen during the pandemic, some sheriffs say, I'm not going to enforce the mask law. I'm not going to do this. So it shows they don't have to pay attention to the laws if they don't want to. Like a mask, so I'll be quiet now.
No, I love it. And how we're seeing they're so interwoven. Like these systems are so interwoven, and we see how it's not just an individual that's being impacted. It is the whole family unit, a cultura as a whole, generations as a whole, that we are still feeling the impact today. So one of the questions are like that I want to maybe reframe or re-ask is like, what are the reform opportunities that you see or that you want to see to shift this trajectory, that are perpetuating the narratives that criminalize the Latina communities, and how has the work that you're doing kind of shifting and contributing to this?
I want Maritza to run for president. That's my first policy change.
Me too. Yo también.
Well, I spoke about, well, that's funny. I'll just say, the more time I spend in DC, the less I ever want to run for political office. So uninspiring. Yeah. I'd rather be on the outside agitating. I see that as my role. But I did talk about marijuana reform. I do think we're at a unique opportunity with, really being on the precipice of passing comprehensive marijuana reform and legalizing marijuana. But another opportunity I see is around harm reduction. There's more conversations now around harm reduction, which means meeting people who use drugs where they're at, not in a judgmental way, but just making sure that we keep our community members alive. So those are areas of hope that I see, at least in the drug policy space. And of course, they have massive criminal justice implications.
What you just said, it's decolonizing work, because when you legalize marijuana, you're decolonizing something that was used to harm and to criminalize, because the use of marijuana, of cannabis, is medicinal in many of our ancestral practices. And so much of that healing, so much of that aftercare that you were saying, like, that is also decolonizing, because when we heal, that's when we come back into our power. If we stay in the system, if we stay oppressed, if we stay in that, we're going to perpetuate that cycle. So we decolonize when we heal and when we take back the power that we have as a community. We will be taking questions from the audience, so please start putting them in the chat. We're excited to have this conversation be interactive and collaborative.
I just wanted to add to that some amazing examples, like the work that folks or Dignity and Power Now is doing in Los Angeles, shutting down prisons and shutting down jails and taking that money and putting it back into the community. There are real grassroots organizations on the ground doing the work. And Eunices Hernandez, who's now in city council, comes from those movements. Shout out to Lex Stepling, who's doing that work. Shout out to those folks that are doing the work in LA to shut down the prisons and to put it back into the media. It's happening, it's exciting work. The Drug Policy Alliance, the work that y'all are doing in New York. We have safe injection facilities now. The decriminalization is so powerful. And I also just love seeing women of color in positions of leadership. So we have Maritza, we have Cassandra Frederic at the top of the Drug Policy Alliance, right? We have Carmen Perez with the Gathering for Justice. I mean, these are organizations that are really working with the grassroots to mobilize and move folks. And the other thing I love seeing is folks leading in their own communities, like Eunices, like others. I think that is so important. So we need to see more of that. Sorry, I got a little excited, but that's exactly what I want to see. Yeah.
I love it. And another question for both of you before we start taking questions from the audience is like, how can philanthropy invest to move the needle, not only on criminal justice reform, but bridging the needs for reintegration for those detained? So a little bit of the reform, a little bit of the resources that we need as a community to uplift and increase that resistance and that healing that we want, that intergenerational resilience and resistance and healing that we also carry in our bodies.
Yeah, so I'd like to respond to that, but first I want to go back to, again, something Hedel was saying. I've also really have been inspired recently by the grassroots campaigns that we've seen in various parts of the country to close jails, to not build new jails, to divest from jails and immigrant detention centers. And again, these are like grassroots campaigns that have been happening across the country. I feel like those have been really powerful. But speaking of, cops not having to enforce the law, as much as I, give a lot of, as much as I talk about progressive prosecutors not being an end all be all, and as hard as I am on prosecutors, I do have to say it matters. Prosecutors have the ability to choose to detain people or not detain people, to convict people or not convict people with charges. And this is especially important when we're talking about Latinos. I'm thinking pretrial detention and bail and setting bail rates. Latinos actually are more likely to get high bail rates, be unable to pay those bail rates, and are more likely to be to experience pretrial detention and detention generally. It is really important, I think, to have people in those positions. Prosecutors are like the top cop of a jurisdiction, and this is a prime example of where they could really use their discretion to do something good for people, so that they don't lose their jobs and can stay with their families. But to answer your question around funders, I think one thing that I really would like to see funders do is actually fund Latinos and Latino-led groups that are doing the work around criminal justice reform and ending immigrant detention. I'm thinking about groups like Mi Gente, groups like Latino Justice, that are doing the work through a Latinx lens. I think something that funders tend to do is kind of fall into this black-white binary, which is a binary that is very present in the U.S. that leaves no room for Latinos. We have to understand that Latinos are disproportionately targeted, always have been disproportionately targeted and impacted by both the immigration and criminal justice systems. But we're undercounted and underinvested in, which also means that, we can't provide the support to our communities that they need. We have to have culturally responsive solutions. And that can't happen without the support from funders and like-minded folks. I think it's probably my greatest frustration working in this space that, Carol was saying earlier that I'm one of the few Latinas working in criminal justice. It shouldn't be like that. There should be many of us, and I should know all the other people doing all the work, and I should have many people in the community to rely on. But we're just not invested in, even though we're disproportionately impacted. It is the most frustrating thing in this work.
I just want to add to that, when I worked at the Open Society Foundation years ago, and there weren't any formerly incarcerated people as program officers, as leaders, folks that actually felt and understood the community. And I also remember the money switching too quickly and not sticking with organizers through the long run, right? So one, have your program officers be from the community that's directly impacted, right? Don't shy away from hiring folks who understand this firsthand and who are leaders in this field. And don't tokenize folks. Don't invite folks to come speak at your board meeting. Don't invite folks to be on your pamphlet, right? If you're going to do that, pay them, right? But don't think that you can just trot folks around and have them tell their stories and that's okay. It's not okay. They need a seat at the table as well. And echoing with what Maritza said, there are brilliant folks doing this. Mi Gente just released a survey, the first survey ever conducted of Latinx, Latins. I don't know what to say anymore. Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latin, Hispanic, all of them, todo. All the people's thoughts on policing, on criminalization. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. They know what's up. They know what's going on. Latino justice, this brilliant Juan Cartagena, kind of the mastermind behind this criminal justice Latino movement, who's now retired. He's probably playing with his band in Puerto Rico somewhere. That's on him. There's this really good guy named Jorge Renaud, who's the director there, took over my spot, 27 years in prison. And he comes out and he's a real abolitionist. And abolition to me isn't just closing down prisons. It's a practice. It's a form of love. It's a form of parenting. It's a form of being. We hear a lot of white liberals going out there telling Black folk, telling Latinos, we should close down prisons, man. And then getting mad at those brown folk because they're not into it, because they actually live in those neighborhoods, right? So really understanding what abolition is. So I would say for philanthropy, one, listen to everything Maritza said. Two, funding long-term organizations like Mi Gente, like Latino Justice, like Puente Human Rights in Arizona that have been doing this work. And then three, CJ doesn't happen in a silo, right? CJ, economic justice, it doesn't happen in silo. So don't fund in a silo, right? So don't just look and say, I want to deal with you have to look at arrests and deportations and economic justice. Too often I go to the CJ meetings and it would just be black and white. And they'd only talk about CJ. And if we try to bring up immigration, that was the wrong space. Or in the immigration space, right? We would talk about Black folk. We try to talk about arrests, and that was the wrong space. So that's not going to get us out of this problem, right? This problem has been going on since before Nixon, and we haven't gotten any closer to solving it. So I would just say, put the folks who are closest to the issue at the heart of the solutions.
Ooh, I love that. And it's like direct be in touch with the community, with the pulse of what's actually happening, and not, not the private stuff. It's like we need to bridge that gap. We want equity. We want not, it's not a flex that Maritza is the only one. It's like that. It shouldn't be like that. We want Maritza to have a community, to have support, to have like a team of other badass Latinas, Latines supporting one another and working. But we don't even want to be doing this work anymore. We want this work to not be necessary because of the system. So I'm like, como que I'm not mad. Well, I am mad. Mejor les voy a decir una question from the audience. So you mentioned mandatory minimums and the ripple effects that deeply impact families. What are the actions that can be taken to minimize this or to eliminate this?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first stab at this response. So a mandatory minimum essentially means that someone, based on what they were charged and convicted for, usually a drug charge, has to serve literally a mandatory amount of time. Unfortunately, that often leads to people serving very long periods of time behind bars. At the federal level, I mean, anybody who is paying half attention to the world knows that Congress is completely broken, and it's really hard to pass any sort of law right now through both chambers, let alone get it to the president's desk. So I would not, I think it's important to be in touch with your lawmakers at all levels. But I think the action is really happening at the state and local level. I talked earlier about grassroots campaign to, close immigrant detention centers and jails. I think we need to have the same energy for harsh sentencing, extreme sentencing, like mandatory minimums. It really does take people coming together and lobbying at the state and local level and telling their stories to change policy. That I think is more effective and certainly probably faster moving than engaging in the federal space. I think it's important to have watchdogs like me in the federal space, but it's really hard to get anything done, unfortunately.
Well, and to add to that, and Maritza, I'd love for you to help me out because I don't know the full extent of it, but gang enhancements. So you have gang enhancements where if you're just on it, you might not even know you're on a gang database. Just because you live in a specific neighborhood, now you're part of a gang, which is hilarious because LAPD has a gang. They're in a gang. They're the banditos, right? But there's no database for them. There's no enhancement. But gang enhancements as well are something that folks in Chicago, I've seen Black and brown communities get together to try to get rid of gang enhancements, gang databases. And I believe, Maritza, correct me if I'm wrong, there's so many levels of gang databases, right? There's like the local level, then the federal level. You have no clue which one you're on, and it's hard to get off.
Yeah. And, when folks have tried to look at gang databases and figure out what's going on, they have found really wild things like babies even being listed on gang databases. Because essentially it's a way to, it's just the police putting people on a database based on who they hang out with, and targeting, again, Black and brown, usually boys and men. If they're seen with this individual or in a certain neighborhood or wearing a certain thing, each jurisdiction kind of has their own way to identify who is quote unquote in a gang. But those can have devastating consequences because that's another way our people get into the system. Because, let's say that you're in a high police neighborhood. And the cop decides to stop you that day, and they look you up when they ask for your ID and they see that you are in this gang database. Well, whatever they want to charge you with can actually be enhanced because you're an identified gang member. So yeah, I mean, there's unfortunately, so many ways to get into the system and very few ways to get out, and very little support for people who are actually trying to improve their well-being.
Exactly. I love the power of community, of storytelling. Like, we're relying on our people's stories and like lived experience, because I didn't even know about the enhanced gang database, but I saw it growing up. I saw so many of my neighbors, of my classmates getting locked up, or from the school to jail pipeline, that they would just disappear and come back and I got locked up, I got deported. And it was so much because of being targeted, simply because of our neighborhood, because of our socioeconomic status, because of the color of their skin. And that is something that needs to be eliminated because it has lifelong impacts. We have another question. There's been a lot of pushback from reproductive justice in the wake of Roe versus Wade being turned over, with the narrative that voting is a solution. However, voting is important, but it's not the catch-all because of the ways the systems are designed. What role can civic engagement funders potentially play in this work?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about that a lot. Like many people, and I mean, it wasn't just the decision around Roe v. Wade. I think, like, especially these last couple of years, we've all felt very heavily the decision that political leaders have made. And it is very frustrating that all we hear whenever we feel failed as a communities is, well, go vote. And we do, and then nothing happens, or bad things continue to happen. And that could be very frustrating. And it could be such a turnoff to people to not want to vote. They'll feel like their vote doesn't matter. But I always try to remind myself that that's what the oppressors want. They don't want us to vote. They don't want us to engage. They want us to feel hopeless, defeated, like we don't matter. If our votes didn't matter, they wouldn't be working so hard to try to disenfranchise us. And they do it all the time. The criminal justice system being a prime example of one way that they do it. They put the scarlet letter on you and then say, oh, well, you had contact, or you're not a non-citizen, but yet we won't pass immigration reform to ever make you a citizen, but you can't vote, right? So it is important. It's really important that people continue to stay civically engaged. And again, funders should look at or grassroots organizations that are in these communities and doing the work. We named a few, like La Defensa in LA, Mi Gente, based out of Arizona. Like, they're in there doing the work. They know our communities, and they can activate our communities to vote for the things that we care about.
And Mi Gente has an amazing statement. Voting, I vote religiously. I vote every single time. Sometimes I write somebody's name in because I don't like the candidates, but I vote, right? But if you live in a gerrymandered district, your vote ain't going to do shit, right? So it has to be more than just voting. And Mi Gente has this amazing slogan that's con el Estado, contra el Estado, del Estado. I think I might have screwed that up. Sorry, Mi Gente, which essentially means you work within the system, you work against the system, and you work
outside the system. Right?
Thank you, Maritza. Thank you. You saved me.
Right, yeah, I think that was right. Yeah.
You saved me. And in essence, it's more than just voting. Vote your ass off, knowing that that's, like Maritza just said, not the final solution. So other things like lobbying, protesting, right? Getting your own folks in office. Because they are the other thing I thought was amazing when Maritza mentioned disenfranchisement. If you live in a jail in a small rural town, you don't have the right to vote, but they count that population in the census. So that little jail gets that much more representation for having all those Black and brown bodies, even though those Black and brown bodies don't get to vote.
Dios mío, I loved what you were saying too, Maritza, about the learned helplessness and hopelessness, because that is what they want us to feel and to think and to have that like sense of like my voice and power. I don't have power. And yet, like, kind of when we organize, when we gather, when we are part of the community, we see the power that we have as a community, as a collective, that our voices do matter, our votes do matter. But what I think, like, what matters more is that we have to start seeing ourselves through the eyes of as if we are a revolution, simply by being and resisting and organizing and gathering. So as we have like these last few minutes, I want to give you both an opportunity to share any closing statements that you'd like to share with our community, with our audience here today.
Well, I was just going to thank Latinx House for hosting this conversation. As Hedo said at the top of this panel, this is a really important conversation, one that I would love to see more Latino advocacy around. So many people in our communities have been impacted by the criminal legal system. And I think, with the criminal legal system and also with drugs, many other things, but those are the spaces that I work in. I know there's also a lot of stigma and misunderstanding. And I think conversations like these are just critical to getting more people to understand the work that we're doing. Something that I still struggle with. I mean, I'll be honest, I don't even think my parents really get it. Right. So I'm like, hey, if I can like get my parents to get it, I think then I'll be like a more solid advocate, right? Like, we have to do that work. So it's an important conversation. So thank you for hosting. And I'll just plug the Drug Policy Alliance. I would encourage you all to follow our work. You can visit us at dpa.org. We are working at the state, local, and federal level to protect bodily autonomy and the rights of people who use drugs. Definitely check out our work.
Gosh, I didn't want to follow Maritza. I was scared that was going to happen. I'm nervous now. So I would just, again, also thank Latinx House, Monica Ramirez, David Chavez. I can't see your name there. Daniel Ma, Lisa, and our two interpreters whose names I forgot. I think one of them is Brianna. Thank you, Brianna and Stephanie. Muchas gracias. And to funders, I would just say really tap into the folks with the knowledge. So many organizations are catch-all umbrellas that don't actually do this. They fake it till they make it, and they just get in the way, right? We didn't mention them, but you know who they are. I would say have conversations with folks like Maritza, with Mi Gente, who we've mentioned so many times, with usually LPPI, with the smaller grassroots that are really doing this work with or without your money. Right? Those are the folks that really need this. And then also include the families of those who are directly impacted. Again, Andres Guadardo hasn't had justice. He was shot and murdered by police, 2 years ago? And I check every week and there's no follow-up. So I would just say, again, thank you for the space for this much needed conversation. I don't have anything to plug, so I'm going to plug Maritza for Senate 2028. Let's make it happen, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Jerónimo. Thank you, Maritza. Because this is a critical conversation. This is a meaningful conversation that needs to continue to be had, not only in spaces like this, but, with our parents, in our cocinas, with our tias, with our tios, with our primos, with our neighbors, because this is something that has been impacting so many of us, and we want it to stop impacting us in such a negative way. Thank you, Latinx House, for continuously creating spaces like this, where we can have purposeful conversation, but also long-lasting connection, because now I feel like these are my hermanes that I want to support the work that you're doing. I want to continue to fight alongside you and support you in whatever way that I can, because not only are you doing this meaningful work, but also you need to be supported as individuals, because you carry so much on your shoulders. And I want to thank you. And to our audience, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation, for engaging, and for funding grassroots organizations and listening, because this really matters, and this is life or death for so many of us, and this can really shift our community, that we really need to have these changes from up, down, and up, arriba y abajo y por todos lados. So thank you so much, and I hope you all take care.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
This concludes today's critical conversation, the impact of incarceration and the criminal justice system on Latinx communities. Thank you for joining us. We invite you to tune in for Episode 6, Achieving Equity for the Latinx Community, on August 16th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern. Critical Conversations is a Latinx learning series powered by the Latinx House and the Ford Foundation, with support from Hispanics in Philanthropy.